Hello, throttle control. Come on, why isn't the throttle on my joystick working? I know this game has throttle support. Maybe the README file is something to go on. Okay, turns out that the throttle support, quote-unquote, is based on uploading special digital mappings to actual CH Flightstick Pro and Thrustmaster WCS joysticks. Since DOSBox doesn't emulate that particular aspect of those joystick interfaces, we once again have no real throttle control. Lovely. Alright, I'll admit it. Part of the reason why I reviewed Star Wars X-Wing first was because today's Agent DOS game, Star Wars TIE Fighter, is a much larger game, and I didn't want to have to spend over half an hour talking about it. To put it simply, TIE Fighter is a sort of sequel to X-Wing in that it takes place not long after the evacuation of the Rebels from the planet Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back. But rather than playing as the Rebels, this time you're one of the bad guys, fighting for the Galactic Empire as they seek to crush the rebellion and retain their iron grip over the entire galaxy. Supposedly to promote peace and order, but we all know that's a lie. TIE Fighter is actually extraordinarily similar to X-Wing, and the particular version I have is the Collector's CD-ROM, which has a few additional features over the original game. But now I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's get the game stats out of the way. Star Wars TIE Fighter was created and released by LucasArts in 1994 and is a one-player first-person action simulation game, just like X-Wing. Unlike X-Wing, which only supported VGA 320x200 256 color graphics, the 1995 CD-ROM version of TIE Fighter also supports high-resolution SVGA 640x480 graphics, though the original floppy disk release does not. It supports multiple sound and music drivers, and as usual, pick whichever ones sound the best, or stick with Sound Blaster support for sake of simplicity. As for its release date, it's still commercial, and just like with X-Wing, due to the multiple versions of this game that are out there, finding the exact version you want can be a little tricky. The most common version is the 1995 Collector's CD-ROM release, which is the version I'm playing, and beyond SVGA graphics, also includes 2 expansions, providing a grand total of 76 missions, not counting the training missions or historical combat. So yeah, there's a ton of gameplay here. Best of all, this version's also the cheapest, with most copies running between $5 and $15. The original floppy disk version is a little trickier to find, but not impossible, and usually runs $20 to $30. Believe it or not, the most difficult version to find is the 1998 Windows re-release using the X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter engine. In fact, this version is so hard to find that I wasn't even able to get a price on it. So I imagine if you do find a copy, it's not going to be cheap. And again, it's not helped by how similar the packaging and discs look between the DOS and Windows versions. In fact, the only reliable way to tell the two apart is to see if the CD itself says Windows 95/98 on it. True, the title of this particular version should look different than the rest of them, but I wasn't able to confirm whether or not this was a reliable way to tell the DOS and Windows versions apart. So it's better to just look for the Windows 95/98 line instead. Yeah, there's also a Mac OS release, but I wasn't really able to find out any particulars about it. Now, just like in X-Wing, before you begin the game, you register a character and are then presented with a concourse where you can access various parts of the game, including a training simulator, a combat chamber, the tech room, the film room, and battle registration. The training simulator has you fly through a sort of space tube in an attempt to shoot down and dodge obstacles in increasingly shorter amounts of time. The combat chamber provides you with some basic training missions with the various starfighters you can pilot, as well as some historical missions for sake of practice. You can also replay any previous battle missions that you've cleared. The tech room and film room work just like they did in X-Wing, allowing you to check out the technical specifications of the various ships and objects you'll encounter, and to play back recordings you've made of your gameplay. I should note, though, that the tech room has been simplified a bit, and many of the advanced details you could look up in X-Wing simply aren't present here. The meat of the game is, of course, the battle mode, which basically amounts to a series of sort of mini-campaigns called battles, lasting 5 or 6 missions each, with a few of the expansion battles taking more or less. You can switch over to other battles at any point you want, though in order to access the later battles, you have to complete the earlier ones first. And even with the expansions installed, bringing the number of battles up to 13, you only have access to the first 4 until you complete some of them. Before you actually start playing the game, you'll probably want to hit the escape key to access the options menu, where you can change your difficulty level to one of 3 settings: easy, medium, and hard. The difficulty selection only has minor effects on the gameplay, but these minor effects culminate together to make for a surprising difference in the challenge provided. Specifically, the higher the skill level is set, the less damage you do to shields, the more damage your enemies do to your shields, the faster the enemies will move, the more aggressive the enemies will behave, and the more enemies you'll face overall. Again, these differences are all very minor, but they all add together to make the game more or less challenging. And that said, one thing I've noticed is that the AI is actually really bad at aiming. Well, as long as it's not a turret. I don't know why, but the turrets in this game have deadly accuracy, while both the enemy and friendly ships themselves couldn't hit the broadside of a Star Destroyer. And after watching the AI for a bit, I think what it is that the AI just doesn't lead its targets properly, since they have a lot more trouble with a moving target than they do with a stationary one. In fact, it's surprisingly easy to dodge attacks in this game and keep your target in sight all at the same time, not just because of the AI, but also because of the controls. Now, the controls for this game are pretty much identical to the controls in X-Wing, with 2 very big differences. Firstly, the mathematics going on under the hood are far more accurate, meaning it's really easy to move and shoot exactly where you intend to. As long as your frame rate is stable. If the frame rate loses its stability, then the controls can get really erratic until the frame rate's back to normal. Under most circumstances though, even when you're trying to keep one of the lightning-fast A-Wing starfighters in view, it's surprisingly easy to do. Secondly, there's a new button added to the mix for speed matching. By pressing the Enter key on the keyboard, your throttle will be set in such a way that your speed will ultimately match that of your current target. Now, doing this makes it incredibly easy to keep a target in your sights without flying past it, or vice versa, and it also makes it very difficult for said target to turn around and shoot you instead. The only thing you gotta keep in mind is that if you don't have enough engine power allocated, you might not be able to keep up with some of the faster starfighters. And also, the speed matching button only matches speed for the moment, and should your target change their speed, you'll need to hit the speed matching button again to match their new speed. There are a few other new elements added to the interface too that weren't present in X-Wing, the first of which is Subsystem Targeting. When you have a target selected, you can cycle through their various subsystems if you specifically want to try to target one of them for some reason. Because really, there's not many circumstances where you're going to need to do this, since disabling a target without the use of ion cannons is pretty much impossible. Usually, subsystem targeting is only useful when facing the really large targets, like capital ships and space stations. Secondly, there's 3 special indicator lights that appear over your targeting reticle now. The left light turns red to indicate that someone is targeting and firing at you. The middle light flashes green to indicate docking operations, but turns solid green if you're being targeted by turret-mounted weapons. And trust me, you don't want to be targeted by turret-mounted weapons in this game. The right light flashes amber to indicate that someone is attempting to lock on a missile or proton torpedo, and turns solid red if they achieve that lock. But it doesn't necessarily mean they fired anything. If they do fire something, you'll hear a warning klaxon and see a missile launch warning message at the bottom of the screen. Actually, looking at the bottom right of the screen, there's a special indicator to tell you what the time acceleration is set to. Parts of some of the missions may drag out because you have to go somewhere, but it takes a couple minutes or so to actually get there. So in these circumstances, you can hit Alt-T to cycle between 1x, 2x, and 4x time acceleration, just to help get those boring parts over with faster. Another new feature is the addition of special beam weapons, which recharge off of your engine power and have their own energy pool just like your laser weapons and shields. The two kinds of beams you can acquire are tractor beams and jamming beams. And to use a beam weapon, you simply turn it on and get the enemy you have targeted under your reticle. The tractor beam will cause the enemy to slow down significantly, making it an easy target not just for yourself, but for your allies as well, while the jamming beam prevents all weapons from being fired, which is probably very effective against turret-mounted weapons. At least, that's what I'm assuming, because let's be honest here, 76 missions? Even if I was an expert at this game and somehow managed to beat 3 missions an hour, that's still over 20 hours of gameplay, not counting the training and historical combat and everything in between. So again, I wasn't able to really get far enough to sample everything, but this time around it's more because of the amount of content and not because of stupid reasons. For one thing, there's far fewer escort missions this time around, and for the missions that do have escort objectives, usually the targets that need protecting are not flimsy enough to go down by accident. In fact, if you fail any missions this time around, it's usually a result of not clearing certain objectives fast enough, so you just have to approach such a mission differently and you should be fine. One thing that's kind of nice too with the battle missions is that once you get far enough, you can choose your ordnances and beam weapons pre-mission. The first ordnances you can choose from are concussion missiles, proton torpedoes, heavy rockets, and space bombs. The missiles work best against fast-moving targets, but don't do much damage. The proton torpedoes are much more powerful than the missiles, but don't work as well against fast-moving targets. The heavy rockets are fairly slow but really powerful, so they work really well against capital ships, while the space bombs are ridiculously powerful but move so slowly and track so badly that they're pretty much consigned to stationary targets. Later in the game, you get access to advanced missiles and proton torpedoes, which are better overall than their original counterparts, and magpulse ordnances, which disable targets extremely easily. As for the ships you can fly, there's quite a number of them, so I'm only going to touch on each one of them briefly. One thing I should quickly note though is that some of the missions modify the parameters of the ships you can fly, meaning there's no set standards for ordnances or beam weapons, so it's hard to comment on those aspects. The standard TIE fighter is present in this game, but thankfully you only fly this thing for a handful of missions because, let's face it, it can only take 3 hits at best, has no shielding, and unless specifically modified for a particular mission, it has no missile weapons either. The TIE bomber is kind of like the Y-wing, equipped with a good amount of torpedoes for performing bombing runs. And just like the TIE fighter though, it has no shielding and can only withstand a few hits before it gets taken out. The TIE Interceptor is similar to the TIE Bomber in terms of how well it's armored and equipped, but instead of having dual laser cannons, it has quad lasers and a much more powerful engine. One way you can think about these first 3 ships is that the TIE Fighter is analogous to the Rebel A-Wing, the TIE Bomber is analogous to the Rebel Y-Wing, and the TIE Interceptor is analogous to the Rebel X-Wing. One thing that plagues the original TIE designs though is that they're made with as few resources as possible, so that they can be built in massive quantities, the idea being quantity over quality. One thing you learn while going through the training in Star Wars X-Wing is that in a balanced combat situation, Imperial forces usually outnumber Rebel forces 3-1. But of course an X-Wing can tear through a TIE fighter like tissue paper thanks to its advanced shielding, allowing it to withstand the assault of 3 TIE fighters with ease. To combat this, the Empire started producing a more advanced TIE design known simply as the TIE Advanced, though it's also known in Star Wars canon as the TIE Avenger. It's essentially a similar design to the TIE Interceptor, but with the addition of a shield system, allowing it to withstand combat for a significantly larger amount of time compared to any previous Imperial starfighters. As you get further through the battle mode, you'll eventually be exclusively flying ships with shield systems installed. Once you start getting into the expansion missions, you'll get access to the ultra-powerful TIE Defender. Now this thing is a beast, equipped with 4 laser cannons, 2 ion cannons, a good number of ordnances, a shield system, and an extremely powerful engine allowing for some ridiculous speeds, especially if you siphon everything out of your other systems. The only drawback? Actually, there isn't one. The TIE Defender is so incredibly powerful that this is pretty much the only game where you'll ever get to fly one. In fact, the data files for X-Wing vs TIE Fighter has the TIE Defender in its library, but the description for it reads, quote, "This craft is too powerful to be put in this simulation. Dream on, fanboy." There's 2 other ships you can pilot as well, but they're not technically Imperial-made ships, but rather were designed by the Cygnus Spaceworks company, who remained loyal to the Galactic Empire once it took control of the galaxy. The first of these ships is the Assault Gunboat, also known as the XG-1 Starwing. It's actually extremely similar to the TIE Advanced in terms of its defensive capabilities, but its offensive capabilities are more in line with the TIE Bomber, sporting both dual lasers and dual ion cannons. Lastly is the Cygnus missile boat, which is a very unique craft and unlike any of the other starfighters on display. Firstly, it relies heavily on large quantities of ordnance weapons and carries 2 different stocks of them at a time. It has an extremely powerful shielding system and a special device known as the Sublight Acceleration Motor, aka SLAM, which when activated doubles the acceleration provided by your engines, but drains laser energy in the process. Though considering this thing only has a single laser cannon, I guess that's not that big a deal. And yeah, I don't really have anything else to say about the game because really, a lot of the good things I said about X-Wing, including strategies, still apply to this game. For instance, your lasers still recharge 4 times faster than your shield system for the same energy allocation settings, so boosting lasers and removing power from shields, then simply transferring laser energy to shields as necessary, allows you to keep more power in your engines for greater maneuverability. The only new strategy I can really provide is to try and follow your mission objectives to the letter. If you stray from your specific objectives, you run the risk of angering really powerful targets that would normally ignore you, while other friendly units would normally move in and deal with those targets themselves. In fact, the only negative thing I really have to say about this game is that the colors can be a little confusing. You know how in most games red targets are hostile and green targets are friendly? Well, in this game, it's the opposite. Green is hostile, red is friendly. It takes a little getting used to, but is otherwise my only real complaint. Short of the lackluster joystick support that still only supports throttle control through special digital mappings and still doesn't have any rudder control. But for a game that's supposed to really make you feel like you're flying one of these things, you'd think they'd have at least tried to add decent joystick support. Now, I'm kinda guilty of skimping on joystick customization too, so I can understand how they missed it. So that's Star Wars TIE Fighter. Compared to X-Wing, this game is far more fun, far more engaging, and far more immersive. If you're a Star Wars fan or a fan of first-person space shooters, this is definitely a game that will keep you entertained for countless hours of gameplay. And even if you're not into these kinds of games, it's still worth a play at least once just for the experience, especially with a good joystick in hand. DOSBox settings are a little simpler than they were for X-Wing. You can leave cycles set to auto with no issues, but if you have a hat on your joystick, you'll need to set the joystick type to FCS or CH mode to map controls to the hat using the DOSBox key mapper. You'll also want to turn timed intervals off as well as button wrap. And if you're running the CD-ROM version, then you'll probably also want to make an ISO of the CD and image mount in DOSBox to speed up the loading times. Though, one other thing about the CD-ROM version, its joystick support has a few bugs. So if that's the version you're playing, then you'll probably want to download and install the joystick patch from LucasArts, which can surprisingly still be found on their website. But since this is just a patch, I figured I'd upload it to my website and host a copy of it myself so you guys don't have to go searching for it. Just download it, place it in your TIE Fighter folder, run the program to extract its contents, and follow the instructions in the provided README file. Anywho, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week on episode 78, we're going to take a look at a game whose protagonist is named Snake. And no, he doesn't go hiding around in cardboard boxes. Besides, it's a platformer, so I don't think it will really work that well anyways. If you think you know which game it is, then send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and make sure you tune in next Saturday.